So the minimum wage debate continues unabated. It doesn't matter that every school of economic thought except the Keynesians agree that minimum wage destroys jobs for the very people it's supposed to help. It doesn't matter that it's by far the consensus of labor economists. And it doesn't matter that I've completely destroyed the research showing small minimum wage increases having no disemployment effects. Why? Because to lift a phrase from James Randi, they're unsinkable ducks. They're just pseudoscientists peddling their bogosity for the sake of their own political gain, going against every principle of science along the way. But I have all these studies supporting me. Let me explain the issue. Here I have a right triangle. Let's see what size it is. Alright, it's 8 centimeters on one side and 15 centimeters on the other. Alright, so we have 8 squared, which is 64, plus 15 squared, which is 225. Alright, add the two together. 5 plus 4 is 9, 6 plus 2 is 8. You get 289. Alright, so that should be the square of the hypotenuse. Let's see, the square root of 289 is 17. Alright, so according to the Pythagorean theorem, the hypotenuse should be 17 centimeters long. Let's measure it and find out. Hey, the hypotenuse is 17.5 centimeters, not 17. You know what that means? The Pythagorean theorem must be wrong. Do you believe that? For a second? Of course not. And the reason why is obvious. Because it's far more likely that I did something wrong than that a fundamental mathematical theorem is incorrect. Maybe the angles aren't quite right or the surface isn't completely flat. In fact, the angle here is just a little more than 90 degrees. When scientists started observing the orbit of Uranus, things didn't work out like they thought. It wasn't behaving the way an orbiting body should, according to Newtonian mechanics. So what did they say? Newtonian mechanics must be wrong. No! That's not how you react to something like that. The first thought should be that there's something wrong with the observations or the math that was done afterwards. The second is that something else is going on that we didn't account for in our mathematics. In this case, it was the presence of the as yet undiscovered planet Neptune. See, you don't want to just throw away an established scientific law without a game changer of some kind. So let's say you're noticing weirdness with Mercury's orbit, so, learning from experience, there must be a new planet there between Mercury and the Sun. I'm gonna call it Vulcan. That's exactly what French mathematician Urbain Le Verrier hypothesized in 1843. Lots of scientists got on his side. They couldn't find the planet, but they were undeterred. It just had to be there because the only other choice is to overturn an established scientific law. But then there was a game changer. What? You mean the speed of light is constant? And time is relative to the observer? Then you go and do the observations to find out how this affects things like the orbits of planets. Then and only then do you call the fundamental law into question. You don't conclude that Newtonian mechanics is wrong just because of Mercury. You find out some other way that it's wrong and then apply it to Mercury. Once you find out what's really going on and that the actual physics explains the orbit of Mercury pretty well, then and only then can you say that the old physical law was wrong and rule out the existence of Vulcan. Doing it the other way is the tactic of the pseudoscientist. Homeopathy is a good example. There's just no way, according to any law of chemistry that we have, that water can take on the chemical properties of something it comes into contact with. In order for homeopathy to be true, the laws of chemistry and physics must be wrong. But that doesn't deter the homeopaths. They continue to do study after study, generally ones that aren't double-blinded, trying to show that homeopathy works. But here's the thing. Even if you had 1,000,000 studies showing that homeopathy worked, it wouldn't matter. Not without a valid mechanism showing how it can work. And since this mechanism would go against established scientific laws, you need to show a problem with those laws before you can begin to study homeopathy. Here's what you need to understand. The disemployment effect of a minimum wage is the result of a fundamental law of economics: supply and demand. I've shown this before in other videos. When you have a minimum wage, which is a price support on labor, then fewer jobs are offered, despite the fact that more people want to work. This must result in unemployment. So if you do a study on the minimum wage and you come out with no disemployment effects, the first thing you should do is not to claim that you've debunked the idea that minimum wage destroys jobs, because you are going against a fundamental law of economics. It's far more likely that there's something wrong with your study, or some other effect was in play, or the results were otherwise anomalous. Until there's a game changer in economics, until there's something to show specifically that the laws of supply and demand are invalid, or at least don't apply in certain cases, then the only way you can come to your ridiculous conclusion is if that's what you wanted to believe all along, which makes you a pseudoscientist. And while it might be true that you can find issues with some of the overwhelming number of economic studies showing that there are, in fact, disemployment effects to minimum wage, all of those studies have one thing that yours doesn't. They are completely in line with established laws of economics, and you do not get to go against those laws just on your political whim. Until there's a game changer of some kind, then we aren't going to believe your studies showing that homeopathy works. We aren't going to take seriously your claims of getting cold fusion to work. And we aren't going to believe for 1 second that you've proven that minimum wage has no disemployment effects. You could come up with 1,000,000 studies and it wouldn't be enough, because the foundational economics just isn't on your side. There'll be one notable event that will let us know when it's time to re-examine this issue to see if minimum wages are justified after all, and that's when an economist gets the Nobel Prize for overturning the law of supply and demand. Until then, you have nothing.